collegefootballnerds.com, Michigan and Florida. Both sides are probably used to hearing me talk under a different banner of SECfans.com. We have done a little bit of rebrand, and we want to talk real quick about this game. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about it, so you won't get our normal analysis. We're going to go straight into the computer model, see what we can glean from the numbers, and jump off from there. Josh, I'm going to task you with two things. Not only to go straight in the model and talk about the numbers, but also maybe just like the discussion we had with Central Florida, and the game was kind of highlighted by the players that aren't going to be in it, talk about that a little bit and how it might impact the numbers in this game, because you got players from Florida sitting out the game, you got key players from Michigan sitting out the game. This is going to be the absentee bowl for sure, but mainly talk about the numbers, give us a score prediction. Maybe I'll jump in at the end and give one of my own. And we'll go from there.
Right. So as he said, it's kind of skipping ahead to the model. We kind of hate to do this, but we block ahead time that we have to record. It's the holidays. We've both got to travel for family, and we're kind of running out of time today. So this was just randomly the last game on our list to talk about this evening. Florida and Michigan playing yet again in a game that I think all of us hope to see both these teams play somebody else this year, just to see something different. Just for the sake of seeing something different. But our model is a per play model. A lot of people are familiar with that have watched our channel. It looks at how you do versus your opponents, how your opponents did versus everyone else compared to how they did against you. And based off that, we try to project your production against your opponent based off their strengths and weaknesses, your strengths and weaknesses. We take that, and then based off the production that is projected for the game, we generate a unique scoring model for each team. There's no man-made variables here. The computer model is all generating its own variables based off your own history, so it's self-learning. What that does is it allows our model to sort of project how much you're going to score as a good baseline and a good point of discussion. And if nothing else, you get a neutral idea of how good each team is. One of the first things that our model generates is a percentage of opponent averages allowed. I haven't really seen this statistic anywhere else, but it's a pretty easy, useful one. And what it tells you is, as a neutral stat, if your opponents average, 5 yards per carry and you allow 4, you allow 80% of their averages. And the point of that is to tell you whether or not your defense is good or bad, completely adjusting for opponent quality. Florida is not as good as one would normally think. And the reason for that really and truly is what happened at the end of the season due to injuries on the defensive side of the ball. Florida is giving up, at this point, 96% of opponent rushing averages and 92% of opponent passing averages. We often say those numbers, if you really want to be average, are at 95%, because a lot of teams have inflated statistics, right? When you play LSU or, they've played a La Tech, and when you've played, an Ole Miss or a Mississippi State, Mississippi State inflated their numbers playing weaker opponents. So everybody's averages are a little better than they should be. And so holding teams to, you really should do a little better than their average. 96% is a poor run defensive number. 92% is a just pure average pass defense number. Flip side of the ball, Michigan, 76% of opponent rushing averages, 82% of opponent passing averages. Those are both excellent marks. 76% is right borderline elite, not quite elite. Clemson holds teams to 55% of their averages. 82% of the passing averages, same thing. To truly be elite, hopefully you can get that number below 80%. That's hard to do. Alabama's 79%. LSU's been sub 80%. That's kind of where that mark's at. But obviously Michigan, 82% is still very, very, very good. And that number would have been below 80% probably without the Ohio State game, without trying to rub salt in the wound. But that's what that effect of that game had. The result of all this stuff is that Florida is projected to get about 3.9 yards per carry, 6 yards per attempt. I set the mark at 4 yards per carry and 6.5 yards per attempt for competence of both sides, running and passing. Florida doesn't hit either mark, so not really effective offensively in this game. Michigan is projected to be 4.8 yards per carry and 7.5 yards per attempt. That's 6 yards per play. 6 yards per play is pretty solid. Both those marks are competent or more so. So Michigan is expected to move the ball with some effectiveness. Florida, once you fall below the competence marks, as I called it, if you have less than that, if you're getting less than 4 yards per carry, it just gets hard to get first downs, which makes it really hard to drive the length of the field There's a big difference between 4 and 5 yards per carry in just your ability to get a first down in 3 plays and overcome. If you get 5 yards per carry, you can get stuff for 0 yards, run the ball twice, and get 10 yards and a first down. If you're 3 yards per carry, you can't do it. And then that's the difference. So even though the edge isn't too significant, 6 yards per play for Michigan, 4.8 yards per play for Florida, the scoring is pretty different. The model currently projects Michigan to beat Florida 32-16. On Florida's side of the ball, Florida's defense was doing pretty well early in the season. They lost a close game against Kentucky. Kentucky was playing really good football at that point. Kentucky still had a pretty good offensive day. But they were doing good really up until the Georgia game. And when they lost the second quarter in the Georgia game, defense more or less collapsed, gave up over 6 yards per play against Georgia, Missouri, and South Carolina. In particular, the passing defense just more or less imploded. They hadn't given up really too much. They had a couple weekdays. You can say Tennessee and Kentucky. That's deceptive. Tennessee was in garbage time. Kentucky barely threw the ball. They only threw 16 attempts in the game. And then all of a sudden against Georgia, they gave up 10 yards per attempt. Missouri's 8 yards per attempt. South Carolina was 8.5 yards per attempt. And clearly, the defense felt those injuries. So it may be slightly healthier. It's hard to say. But you're still going to be missing Marco Wilson. It's still not the same defense it was early in the season. And that's a big impact. The problem, though, with our model here, with this, what is currently a pretty good projection for Michigan to win the game, it's going to be interesting to see how much of that ground gets lost due to all the guys not playing in this game for Michigan, because the current list of injuries and players that are not going to be active in the game is pretty big. Devin Bush is going to be sitting out the game. Karan Higdon is not going to play in the game. Rashawn Gary is not playing. Aubrey Solomon is not expected to play. It's a lot of guys that are key contributors to this defense that aren't going to play in the football game. And if you look at a list, particularly a list of, for example, like tackles for loss, you have Chase Winovich at the top, but 2 of the top 4 guys, Devin Bush, Rashawn Gary. In total tackles, Devin Bush easily leading the team in overall tackles with 79. It's a huge blow. And it kind of sucks because it's the same thing we had happen to us when we were projecting the UCF versus LSU game. We talked about a lot that we don't have a lot of confidence in that game without Melton and without LSU missing both their starting corners. Real similar to what Michigan's going to be facing without Devin Bush. There's a serious argument that Greedy Williams is the best corner in the country, though I think Fulton may even be better. Both likely starting NFL corners at LSU, both not playing in that game. Same deal for Michigan. You have NFL talent not playing in the game. The drop-off's going to be pretty significant. What the reality of that is I think it's focused more on the defensive side of the ball than the offensive. I think losing Karan Higdon is a loss, and he came on strong late in the year. But this is the flip side of us being critical of Higdon early in the year. Higdon has been an inconsistent back, and as much as he came on late, from a yard per place perspective, he still didn't have 5 yards per carry in those later games. He had one really good game against Penn State with a couple long runs, but otherwise, 4.8 yard per carry against Indiana, 2.8 against Rutgers, 4 yard per carry against Maryland. I think they're going to be okay without Higdon. I think Chris Evans has a higher yard per carry average on the season, 5.4 yard per carry to 5.3 for Higdon. I think Evans is going to be able to carry the load. So I definitely do think it's the defensive side of the ball that will suffer. That's going to make this game higher scoring. I think personally what it really comes down to in a matchup perspective is Michigan, when they're playing teams that are not great offenses, has been able to more or less shut them down. Michigan's scheme, I think, is limited. They're very aggressive and they like to blitz, but they put their guys on an island to kind of an extreme degree. And Alabama does it too. The difference is, as good as the defense is and as talented as the defense is, Alabama has been able to get away with it at times because they have first-round draft picks at corners. They've got guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick and Marlon Humphrey at cornerback. When Michigan has had those guys, they've been really good. I don't know that they have the absolute just surefire lockdown guys at every corner position like you need to be successful. In particular, in that Ohio State game for Michigan, it was pretty obvious pretty quickly what was happening there, and that's that Ohio State was attacking Brandon Watson, and they were attacking Brandon Watson every time they could, every play they could. And it doesn't matter how good the rest of the guys are on the team. If you're in man coverage and you're leaving guys one-on-one, you can't give help, and you're only as good as your worst defender. That's what got Michigan exposed. I think the interesting thing in this game is going to be to see if Florida is able to adjust their offense. And Dan Mullen is a great offensive coordinator and he has a lot of time to prepare to get those one-on-one matchups to be able to get Florida's talent in the receiving core in space. Now, Florida has talent in the receiving core. Van Jefferson is a good receiver. Grimes, particularly Kadarius Toney, is going to be probably a serious matchup issue. Tyree Cleveland should be, but just keeps finding himself in the doghouse. There's a lot of talent there for Florida, and it could be a matchup issue. And I think you're going to see a lot of, as I talked about that Watson issue, you're going to see Toney on Watson a lot because I think that's going to be a real problematic matchup in the slot. But, I still think at the end of the day, in my opinion, Felipe Franks just isn't the quarterback that you need to have to be successful at Florida. He shows flashes of the talent that's there, but he just isn't consistent at all. And he makes poor reads. He doesn't make decisions in the clutch. I think there's going to be a real battle. Whether Emory Jones replaces him or not is an interesting question down the road. I think Emory Jones probably will replace Felipe Franks and be a more successful quarterback. But I just don't think, given their issues, they're going to be able to get over that hurdle to push Michigan's defense. For that reason, I think the model is probably pretty fair. I think it's going to be a little closer due to the missing players for Michigan. I think Florida's going to score a little more. So I have this game 31-27, Michigan over Florida in a close game, but I do have Michigan winning.
So for me, I mean, I don't really know what to do with this game because of who's out and because of the isolation of the conferences. I do think that Florida's defense has been better in previous years where their offense is probably overinflated a little bit and their defense is overinflated a little bit. And stylistically, they don't do a lot of things that give Michigan trouble. But I do like Mullen with a 1 month, layover to really prepare and see where, like Ohio State exposes defense. But man, I'm having a hard time with this one. And even with the absences on the Michigan side, that I think at a single player level outweigh the absences on the Florida side. I'm going to go Michigan this one, 26-14. Tell me what you think about that.
So I think Daniel's projection of 26-14 is probably pretty reasonable in this game. It's not inconsistent with the model. Interesting that it trends to lower scoring, but I don't think that's unrealistic given that Florida will also be, and I think it's an underrated point that Florida is going to be a little bit healthier, and they could come out defensively and play a much better ball game than we've seen. And it's just hard to project. It's hard to project how the two conferences are. To be clear, our model more or less assumes the Big Ten and the SEC are equal. Not completely, but for the most part, it does. It's very difficult to account for the discrepancy between conferences, especially with a 9-game conference schedule and when there's very, very little overlap to give meaningful data points. You got to be careful not to make too much of Missouri beat Purdue in a very close game. What does that mean? Does it actually translate to anybody else? Is that a one-off? You can't do transitive property anyway in football. So it all kind of ends up pretty meaningless. And really what we're looking at is Michigan relative to the Big Ten versus how how strong Florida is in the SEC. The one caveat I'll say at the end of this is I think it's important to understand why these two teams are here and what the role is. So the SEC ends up getting 3 teams in the New Year's 6. And with the flip side of that is it pushes everybody sort of down a slot. Florida here really probably is overmatched. If you look at the standings in conference standings, Michigan clear number 2 in the Big Ten. I mean, there's no question. It's Ohio State 1, Michigan 2. The SEC is a lot muddier. In LSU losing to Texas A&M further muddied the waters and ended up putting Florida in this bowl. But in reality, Florida is probably roughly the 6th strongest team in the SEC. Georgia and Kentucky both finished ahead of them in the East. Alabama, A&M, and LSU all had equal or better records coming out of the West. So you end up with a Florida team that probably, in both our opinions, is probably going to lose this game to Michigan. And it just isn't surprising because Florida just isn't a top 10, top 5 caliber team, more than likely. They may come out and shock us, and if so, that's probably going to be a negative thing for the Big Ten. It's kind of a lose-lose, honestly, for Michigan. If they beat Florida, they beat a team that they should beat. They beat a team that is, 5th or worse in their conference as a number 2. And if Michigan loses this game, then it's going to be kind of a black eye for the Big Ten.
We're not excited about it.
But it is what it is. The Bulls decided to give us this matchup.
It is another
again
interesting data point for these two conferences
recently, multiple times.
And I'm sure the players
and so we just kind of have to deal with it, and we'll see how it goes.
Fan bases need to understand. That's not where I want to go with that. All right, y'all. That's pretty much it for this one. Sorry again that it wasn't one that we were able to do a full-blown sort of analysis of it, and we had to go pretty much model only with this discussion. Like Josh said, it's the holidays, and we're really scrambling to get these out the door, get as much content as we can before these bowls really start swinging, getting into full swing. So just a reminder, please subscribe if you haven't already. Give us a like. If you liked it, comment either way. Let us know what you think about our content and about this game. Who do you think is going to win and why? And let us know what you think about the absences in this game, if they're going to have significant impact. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.